My name's Katie Mullan. I'm Dr. Katie Mullan from the University of Leeds. I teach modern and Victorian literature in the English department here.
Hello, my name's Professor Francis O'Gorman, and I'm Professor of Victorian Literature in the School of English at the University of Leeds. And I've written mostly about 19th century literature, and I'm particularly interested in questions of what life might mean as a way of talking about literary texts. And what we're going to do now is we're going to try to talk a little bit about a tricky and precarious term in literary criticism and literary history, the concept of literariness, or the literary itself. And our first question, really, Katie, is going to be whether this notion of the literary or literariness is actually helpful at all.
I think that the term is a very fluid and quite a vague one. On the one hand, I think lots of people know what one means when you say literary fiction. Literary fiction is often a category. In bookshops, you see literary fiction up on the top of the shelves alongside other categories, crime fiction, biography, cookery, and so forth. And literary fiction is a distinct category. It's often different from classic fiction in a bookshop as well, and that in itself is interesting. But literary fiction tends to be understood as the kind of fiction, mainly, that is reviewed in broadsheet newspapers, that is perhaps up for literary prizes like the Booker, and has a sort of certain cultural cachet about it so that we recognise.
This is one of the notions, isn't it? If I thought of literary fiction then in those terms, I suppose that I would be expecting, probably without thinking about it too much, I'd be expecting that novel to expect quite a bit from the reader. I'd be expecting words there to be working quite hard to communicate sense, and the novel itself to be perhaps quite dense in some ways, serious, thoughtful perhaps, to be written in a certain kind of way, which might include literary allusion, might include some kind of what we might think of as poetic writing. Literary fiction in that sense would be more challenging, but also more rewarding, we might think, to read than something which wasn't categorised in that way.
There's also the question of theme. Literary fiction might, for example, take as its theme a wider cultural question or a particular political issue, or it might choose to portray a particular age, for example, the 1980s, or so on, and say something about that. Or take a theme, for example, like multiculturalism, for instance. That these big themes and big questions are often seen as a provenance of literary fiction.
Though it's interesting, isn't it, to see that some classic fiction, what we might think of as fiction from the past, is sometimes marketed, isn't it, in a way which suggests that it isn't classic or literary in any particular way. So I'm thinking here of the ways in which, say, Jane Austen novels, Elizabeth Gaskell novels, have been repackaged quite literally in terms of their covers, in a way that suggests kind of chick lit or romance, and so they might appear actually in a different part of the shop from where you would expect them to be.
And indeed, classic literary fiction, that rather complex term in itself, is often packaged to tie in with television series, with films. So you get pictures of actors and actresses on the front of Austen novels, for example, or Trollope novels more recently, to tie in with the Andrew Davis adaptations for the BBC. So you get that kind of crossover where a text that might be considered to be classic and literary is marketed as popular entertainment, which has an interesting history in itself, in the way in which lots of Victorian novels were themselves not originally conceived of as literary, but were conceived as popular and entertaining.
That's an important thing to observe, isn't it? But here we've been talking really about people in bookshops, anybody, you and me, going into a bookshop and trying to decide what novel to buy. But of course there are literary critics, aren't there? People who want to think seriously and talk seriously about books. Is this category of the literary, then, much use to them? Perhaps we could start by thinking about some of the problems that are involved in using the literary in serious, in thoughtful literary criticism.
Well, there are problems of definition when you start to think about books from a critical perspective, from an academic perspective. I think it's quite difficult to decide what the literary is. And one way of thinking about it in a university context is what makes a book fit to be included on a university syllabus? What makes a book available to study by a group of students and their teachers? And that's a kind of very much an open question. There are all kinds of issues around the canon, around what kind of books get into the canon and what kind of books are left out. And you're drawing a boundary, and that boundary has been very much challenged, particularly in the last 40 years or so, in the 1970s, by feminist critics who asked where the women writers were in the literary canon, and also by scholars of African American literature, and scholars of Anglophone literature from other cultures who ask questions about cultural provenance and value.
So you'd say for them the category of the literary, if it wasn't very clearly defined, might actually be problematic in that it excluded people for actually different reasons other than some kind of notion of literary quality.
That's right, yes.